Welcome back to the Practical Spirituality Podcast. We are so excited to have you on this journey with us, where we explore all elements of mind, body, emotions, and soul through the lens of everyday life. On this week's episode, we are exploring and unpacking our obsession with doing and how that shows up as busyness in our daily life.
Hello, Kim.
Hello, Gareth.
So, what are we talking about on this week's episode?
I think we're going to jump into our obsession with doing. I think it's a good idea for us to bring up this topic of the obsessions that we have with doing in our society today and how that applies to our spirituality or lack of when it comes to the doing. And I think it's important to understand that we've all been caught up in so much of what we've been taught throughout the years that we actually think doing is the goal instead of being. And I think we're coming right back to mind, body, soul, and emotions and how we can make that transition from being so consumed with doing and coming back to simplifying into being.
I think it's a really interesting conversation. I am genuinely intrigued to see where it goes because I do think it's such a hard thing to have an awareness of with any person. And as you mentioned, there are even just societal expectations, what we've seen our entire lives. But then there's a reality of when we're just in the routine of being that busy in the busyness and doing everything. And especially if you're in a chaotic job, have a family at home, there not being enough hours in a day to get through everything. So therefore you just have to do as much as possible and be as busy as possible.
Right.
The reality is there is so much to do, but there's also a reality of there's so much we don't want to look at and deal with also.
I would agree with that.
And then, of course, when anyone says, so it's, you need to slow down, you need to be with yourself, it's very hard, as I'm sure you can remember from many years ago, it's very hard not to scoff at that and be like, seriously, I have too many things to do. And even when you do take that time to actually slow down, or just the mind is racing, as we would have talked about in previous podcasts, and the emotions are high, and it's like, I can't afford to stop. So I think it's just going to be interesting to talk out this episode and kind of see where does that obsession with doing and running full steam ahead and being that busy, as you mentioned, what is the spiritual meaning behind that, and maybe what insight we can provide people and maybe some tips along the way.
I think it's going to be a very interesting episode. And I think when we dive right into it, we have to look at what are some of the reasons that we get caught up in the doing. I think from a very young age, especially these days, if you're a small child, I want you to think about it. All of a sudden, you need to be going to play group. You need to be going to play gym. You've got to go to swimming lessons. You've got to get ready for prep. There's all these things, and your parents are working. It's this constant stress of being on the go all the time. And so we know from all the studies that are out there that behavior modification shows that whatever we experience when we're really, really young, that's what we tend to model and become in our adulthood. And so gone are the times when life was really simple, because now we've got electronic devices and we've got all these things to capture our attention, and we get lost in it. And then we get behind, and so then we're running to catch up as well. I think there's just so many different reasons people get caught in the doing.
But as you were mentioning, it's just that reality from such a young age. And it's even, as you mentioned, getting ready for school, running out the door. It's just we get so used to being rushed and overwhelmed. So it just becomes our new normal. And then if that becomes our new normal, then we find ways to actually match that through other areas of our life, let it be in our school work, or let it be in our relationships, friendships, or even with our family. And it is a modern societal reality for a lot of us.
For a lot of us. And then, as you said before, add in the traumaticness that might happen. And as a way of trying to survive in the world, if I get busy, then I don't have to pay attention to the pain, or I don't have to focus on the pain, or how I'm feeling alone, or how I'm feeling abandoned, or how I feel isolated, or how I feel like there's something wrong with me. Name the many different reasons. And so if we're really busy, then we don't have to look at that. And that becomes a real coping skill for so many of us. So there's so many things. And then we're in a culture where we've got that social media stuff as well. And then, I think the thing I hated even when I was growing up, the keeping up with the Joneses mentality.
But 100%. And I think it's that often, as we've talked about before in previous episodes, is that we use this busyness or obsession with doing to actually avoid so many different areas of our lives and mind, body, emotions. And then because that's that reality and we're stunted in our growth mentally or emotionally for whatever number of reasons, is that we're trying to keep up appearances, let it be through social media, the car we have, the house, the family, because we have that deep imposter syndrome,
Yes.
or that we're constantly trying to be somebody we're not, or we're trying to fake it until we make it. And I think that is something that we've all done different periods throughout our life, go into the real world and then come home and be like, oh, great, I faked it another day. I can live another day of people thinking I'm this way when really I'm not.
Yes, absolutely.
As we both know, when we're running that, though, at a subconscious level, we're not even aware that that's exactly what we're doing.
No, most of the time we're not. And also, the other cause that goes behind that, when we're running that fake it till we make it or the imposter syndrome, I know for myself, it came from I was constantly running away from the pain that I felt in my childhood. And so that if I was running and busy,
Yep.
then I didn't have to turn around and feel those feelings that made me feel like an alien from outer space instead of a human. And so if I did what everybody else was doing and got busy, busy, then I looked normal, for lack of a
Yep.
better way of saying it.
But again, it makes a lot of sense. But it also goes back to, and I know this has been our conversation, even to why we have certain addictions, let it be to substances, food, behaviors, or patterns. And that feeds into the consumer culture as well, because we use all of this to actually distract ourselves, to feel something, to feel good about ourselves, and to continue trying to climb any sort of ladder, let it be personally or professionally. But as we both know, is that there's always going to be someone with a better job than you, the nicer car, the bigger family, smaller families, whatever you're actually trying to grip onto. So that's why it just feels like we cannot let ourselves slow down or even just be in our own company, because that means we're not doing and not achieving something
Exactly.
to get other people's approval.
Exactly. I agree with that 100%.
But I think social media is a huge part of actually what constantly has us comparing ourselves to other people. As you said, keeping up with the Joneses. And it is a tale as old as time. But social media has actually brought it in right into front of our faces 24/7.
Absolutely, it has.
But I do know actually removing myself from social media and even having different no phone zones throughout my house has actually made such a huge difference. So I'm not isolating myself completely from it, but at the same time trying to find that balance, because it was becoming deeply unhealthy. And especially if you're on your own business, you're doing your own thing, the obsession of being on your phone and obsession of answering each email, responding to text messages. It's just back 20, 30 years ago, it was a simpler time when those things just weren't an option. You were kind of forced to be at home. You were forced to leave work at work. So there's no me time at all now.
Well, even if we go back 20 years ago, I remember the very first time that I keyed into my own busyness, that obsession with doing. Now, part of that came before my daughter said to me, but then there was a day that I picked my daughter up from school and she said, "Mom, how was your day?" After I'd asked everybody how their day was. And I said, "Well, I got this done, this done, this done, this done." And she kind of chuckled and she said, "Have you ever noticed that a good day for you is a day when you get a lot of things accomplished, and a bad day is when you've been chasing your tail and you haven't got anything done?" And it was like a slap in the face, because I was like, that's not okay. Maybe it is true. And it was really an eye opener. And then when I really dove into looking at that, what I started to discover was, for me at that stage of my life, and this is long before the phones and social media and everything started getting really big, was my busyness was a way of making me feel important. If I was busy, then at least I must be worth something because I'm busy. Does that make sense? It's just a coping mechanism that I picked up, along the way. And because of my own low self-esteem for many years, if I was always busy, then it didn't put the spotlight on how isolated I was, or how I felt like I didn't fit, or that I wasn't doing certain social things.
But that's what's interesting, is using busyness as a way to actually create separation. Or I think when you hear someone going, "I'm just so busy lately," it often does mean burnout in a lot of respects, or not needing any more overload. We use that as a verbal cue to disconnect from a lot of different situations. I'm just too busy for that. I'm too busy to have this conversation, or I'm too exhausted, too tired to go there right now. And because of the lack of burnout, a lack of presence, and basically that disconnection from others around us. And so when we finding ourselves wanting to disconnect from others, that actually means we've already pretty much disconnected from ourselves.
Right.
And that's why I think the busyness continues to increase, because all we know to do is to keep moving forward. Because if we stay in the present, that means we actually have to start looking, feeling, thinking about things. If we go into the past, that brings up our fears, anxieties, traumas. So therefore, we just have to keep pushing into the future, because that's the only thing we know how to do, because that's the only thing that's unknown and potentially feels safe to us, because it's just that I just need to keep pushing forward.
I would agree with that. But the other thing that it does, when you talk about the lack of presence, in my childhood, because there were so many kids and there was so much going on, I never really learned how to have fun
Yep.
or play. And so I know that when my kids were little, I got really busy, because when it came time to be present to them, it felt really awkward and strange. And as much as I wanted it, I didn't know how to do it. Like,
Mm.
I would force myself to sit down and play games with my kids, because I wanted to break that pattern we were talking about. But the awkwardness that I felt, because they were laughing and having fun, and it just felt like I didn't know how to do that.
Yep.
So the busyness was another way of not being present and not having to face the fact that I don't know how to do that fun thing that many people do know how to do. It causes lots of problems in so many different ways. You look at relationships, and I know we'll talk about relationships many times over, but when you get caught up in the doing, it's very easy, especially when you have young kids, between getting them off to school, feeding them, doing the grocery shopping, working, cleaning the house, getting the laundry done, time to actually be present to your partner or your spouse and actually have time out becomes just another chore that has to be done for so many people. And it's a way that couples end up disconnecting. They get their kids to a certain age and they look at each other and they don't even know each other anymore, because they've just been doing, 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 doing.
Which again comes back to the societal expectations, because from since any of us can remember, we've been just trying to push through life as quickly as possible and ticking the boxes that are expected from us. And even when you talk about relationships, basically saying I need to be in a relationship as quickly as possible. Then you need to get engaged, then you need to get married, then we need to get a house, and then we need to get kids, and then we need to, and it just keeps going. And before you know it, 20, 30 years have passed. And then you're looking at each other going, where'd all that time go? The obsession of being on the go all the time, because we're just that determined to tick the societal norms and boxes. And that brings up a whole different conversation of wanting approval and just wanting to, again, not do anything non-traditional.
I think one of the things that I really want to point out, as someone who has suffered from this for most of my life, is I didn't know any other way.
Mm.
And I remember the very first time that I sat down to meditate, and I remember thinking, oh, this is going to be a mistake. And I was quite shocked when I actually was able to go into a meditation and I was able to sit still in a chair. You got to remember, ADHD child.
Yep.
For me to sit down in a chair for an hour straight without having to jump up 10 times would be considered a miracle for me.
Mm.
And I know there's many other people, especially with what's happening in the world today, and the busyness of the chaos. So it was quite a shock for me. But then I didn't even stick with that for very long until you and I started looking at the stillness and the running. And so we might call it doing, but I'm calling it running, because for me, that's what I was doing. I was running away from the past. I was running away from the pain. I was running away from the inability to love me, because I didn't know how at that stage. And so the busyness and the doing and the being on the go all the time suited me just fine, because I didn't have to. And I remember the first time you and I talked about stillness and I had to sit and do a sit. 10 minutes felt like a jail term. That's just me being honest. It felt like a jail term, because by that time, my mind was telling me all the things I needed to get done and what I was neglecting because I was sitting still, wasting time.
Yep.
So I think it's important that, we get caught up in it, but we never stop to examine the why we're caught up in it.
Which again is a very hard thing to do on your own, because even when we're sitting with ourselves, it's not as if we have anyone often beside us that can actually walk us through why our mind is at us, what emotions are coming up. So it's not surprising that it's a daunting thing versus, and this is why I even say when we're so used to doing that, even when we're relaxing, it's like, I'm going to relax now and clean the entire house.
Yes.
And there's that.
Yes.
And then I'll feel better about myself and then I'll be relaxed. Mm-hmm. That's a very common thing. So that as long as we're doing something, we're feeling relaxed versus things we feel absolutely having to oblige to do by external parties versus things we want to do for ourselves. So even when we're busy doing something for ourselves, like cleaning our own home, that can feel relaxing because we don't get to focus on ourselves, but we're still, as you say, on the run. We're still so busy. It's not until that level of burnout becomes so big or the disconnection from ourselves, and then it begins to impact our own relationships, our friendships. That's when it becomes quite apparent that this obsession of having to run and to be doing everything all the time and to be so busy, when that comes into effect. And the reality is, it's not until something often big happens in our life that we actually are forced to give ourselves permission, if you want to put it that way, to have to take a step back. And the reality is it's also illnesses that come into our lives, let it be within ourselves or with a loved one, that actually forces us to stop. And we do experience that in small magnitudes, let it be when we pick up a cold or a flu or infection of some kind that literally wipes us. But then we're too busy trying to fight the illness, too busy trying to fight the cold or flu to get back up to top levels of functioning again. I think that's why we will be doing an episode, I'm sure, on understanding why the body goes through what it goes through on a spiritual level as well. But I think in general, when we get sick, let it be a terminal illness or let it be something as simple as a cold or flu, it does completely make you re-question what you're doing in life, how busy you are, looking at your mind, body, emotions. And it just goes to show our obsessions, because there's no avoiding it, especially when our body forces our hand.
I would agree. And I also think that one of the things that happens when we are not aware of it and we get sick, the thing that runs through our mind at that stage is, if I don't get up and get going again, I'm going to fail. Like success is based on how much I'm doing instead of who I am.
Yep.
And we get so caught up in that we don't know how to identify with what that peace or that joy or that feeling good about ourselves actually means. For many years, I've looked at the fact that this whole idea of having fun, I can have fun. I don't want to say that, but it doesn't come naturally to me. And so many people in my life have said to me, you're always so serious. Well, yeah, I am, because that's how I stayed alive, for a long period of time. And so the sitting back and relaxing felt like a privilege that others got. That is where the ideology is messed up, because I think really we are here. We are called human beings for a reason, that we're meant to be, not do all the time. And so once we start to learn how we can just stop, drop into that stillness, and when we do drop into it, then we get to actually discover who we are. Because most of us don't even know. We wouldn't know what made us happy if it hit us in the face, because we're trying to get to that end result.
But I think even the idea of stopping probably sounds like an exhausting process for a lot of people as well.
It was for me.
Yeah, because it's that, at least even though we're busy and we have an obsession with doing, at least it's familiar.
It's very familiar.
It is what we find so familiar and comforting, because it's, as we talked about earlier, so suddenly, as you were mentioning, when someone makes that recommendation of starting to understand the little details in life, slow down, it's just very hard to comprehend. But what is in that for me? Because especially when people are very logical, like, I still have bills coming through, I still have a million things to do, I don't have time to do X, Y, and Z. And especially when you can't relate to the elements of your positive emotions or joy, simply because we've all had full lives that have a lot of experience that we still don't understand. It's that even if we were to slow down and then maybe even have to work on ourselves, or even, as we talked about in previous episodes, some of these things are just so overly simplified at times. And I know we all have to start somewhere, but even the process of doing is such an addictive trait in us all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you were saying that, and it made me think of a story years ago when I worked at drug and alcohol rehab, and I was practicing at the beginning of practicing present moment awareness. Now, you have to understand, not only was my body busy all the time, my mind was racing constantly. And so I was always, as I used to say, 90 to nothing from the minute my eyes opened till the time my eyes closed at night. I'd been practicing present moment awareness for a while, and I went to the rehab one morning, and one of the things that we would do is we would have a morning check-in. And we were having this morning check-in. It was out on the back patio, and we were going around, and people were saying how they felt that day. I'm so embarrassed to say this, but I have to say it anyway. So we're going around. It got to be my turn. I paused to think about how I was actually feeling. And out of nowhere, I was like, oh my gosh, do you hear those birds? I've never heard those birds before. There's actually birds. And everybody looked at me like, are you crazy? But I had never had the space in my head to hear the birds singing in the morning. Now that sounds ridiculous, but it was so exciting for me because I was like, oh, that was just part of the chaos in the back of my mind for so long. And this was the first time that I actually heard the birds singing. It's like, it's such a beautiful sound in the morning. That is one of those things that you're talking about. Stopping for me was very hard. But when I did, it's the weirdest things where you find joy when you stop.
Yep.
And I think that's what people don't understand. They're afraid they're not going to find the joy.
But it's often in the details.
Yeah, exactly.
But this is where when we can't find the joy in life or in the little details, that's why it's natural to expect that we're not going to feel as inspired about life or even any level of creativity and they are some of the realities of having some of the downsides of the constant busyness. Because if you talk to any person, everyone has a creative bone in them to some degree, and let it be painting. Everyone wants to write a book or play music or pick up the guitar, piano, whatever the instrument might be. And it's that when we don't make that time for ourselves is to do something we really want to enjoy and to find that joy within ourselves, the constant busyness will constantly take those opportunities away from us. But it's that we all have an idea automatically of what would bring us joy, and it's often in the simpler things within life. It's not often the big spending of money or buying X, Y, and Z. It's actually in the things that we don't currently feel we have time for that we know will feed our soul now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For me, it was like, do you remember putting the kayak in the water and spending an hour on the water in the kayak and how much joy that brought? Hi there. We hope you're enjoying this week's episode. We've been so delighted to see such a fantastic response to the show. And we're excited to now offer you a way to get even more from the podcast. We've been building our Patreon community and are now offering a range of benefits, including weekly bonus episodes, articles, early access to our regular episodes, and weekly check-in polls. And here's something special. We are hosting monthly live question and answer sessions, a fantastic chance to interact directly with us and get your questions answered. We've designed different tiers on Patreon, ensuring there's something for everyone. Find your fit and join us by clicking the link in the episode description or visiting www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. We're excited to welcome you to our Patreon community. Let's continue our journey in practical spirituality together. So I think one of the other things that we want to do then is we always talk about the differences between the two, and then it comes back to how do we find the balance? Because we can't just stop doing. That's not realistic.
Yep.
And we can't just be all the time. And so how do we find that balance between the two? And that's really where I think most people would like to know the ABCs of how to do it.
Yeah, because I know you've talked about present moment awareness in different stages before, and there's also been hearing a lot of people talk about the present moment so much. Is that that's great if you can get to a place in your life where you have the opportunity, you're willing to give that to yourself. And there can, as we've always talked about, there's so many things that can be brought up in those moments. So even if you do find joy in that present moment, as we've been really real on this podcast, is that you have to turn your reality at some stage, and let that be to your
Mm-hmm.
partner, your kids, your job, the bills. And I think that's how do we begin creating balance between those two worlds? Because I know for myself, and from talking with you as well, is that they used to be so separate for such a long period of time that the idea of going back to reality actually created fear within the safe place that you created for yourself.
Exactly.
And I was like, do I really have to? So what's some of the advice that we want to give some people, Kim, on how we start creating balance?
Well, I think, for me, I just have to pull it from personal experience because, again, as we said, it's going to be different for every person. Um, but by simplifying some of the obligations that we have, and I often talk to people that I work with that have young children. I go, make sure that you schedule in date night. And date night's not about the house. It's not about the kids. It's about going out and remembering how to be a couple and how to flirt with each other and have fun, because that's where the balance starts to get created. And I have seen so many couples that do this. And every single time I sit back in awe because it feels like they've done it organically, but
Yep.
they've had someone model it to them. And it just keeps their relationship so alive. And I think it would be no different for us. If we don't go and create a date day or date night for ourselves, even if we are single, where we go and do something that brings us joy, then we lose all that joy. So I think it's about we start to simplify those obligations, and then we start putting in place space for us. And whether you fill that space with painting or a hobby or just sitting or going to the beach or whatever it might be, reading a book. And even though those are doing, it's still space from the achieving
Yep.
type of things.
I think a huge part, and I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, been the same from you since we've known each other, is taking a tech break. And I do think it's so huge because I just feel that even when I was becoming aware of it myself a number of years ago, anytime I'd be doing and I'd be incredibly busy doing something, and then as soon as I'd have time for me, you just find yourself scrolling endlessly. And tell me, Kim, is that you recharging?
No, it's not recharging anything. And if you were me when I was doing that all the time, it's also why I also am not on a lot of the social media sites anymore, because all it ever did for me, the scrolling, was set off the comparison.
Yep.
And all the things that I wasn't doing.
Yep.
And so when I first started doing this, and I first started doing it prior to the big tech explosion. And I used to say it, and all my friends would laugh at me. I'd go, all right, I just want to let everybody know I'm going offline. I'm not answering the phone. I'm not watching TV. I'm not going to the movies. This is, unless you're dying, don't try and get in touch with me because I'm offline. It's 3 days. And it used to be 3 days. And I would know because I would get to this point where I'd feel so full. And I go, I just need space for me. And I still do it today. But like you said, I do it in a different way. I don't not answer the phone anymore, but I don't get on social media. I don't go scrolling. I just spend that time walking the dog or being at the beach or sitting.
And I agree. And I think it's that even looking at, I'm pretty sure every phone has this, when you go in and actually see how many hours you've spent in a given week on any of the apps. And I remember seeing that being like, I could have spent that time, as you said, going for a walk with the dog, even resting. Because on one hand, I was like, I don't have time to do everything. And then when you compare it with the reality of, then why did you spend X number of hours on whatever app and what was actually achieved with it? And as you and I both know, we just get so sucked into that world because it is a distraction away from reality. But we're not feeding ourselves or being a human being or actually looking after our own needs. But as we've talked about before, when have we ever been taught to actually know how to do that?
Well, I don't know many people that do. I will say, though, I think there are some places that teach young kids how to just sit, but they're very few and far between. I haven't seen many of them.
So I think in trying to create that balance and starting off, it is looking at the realities of how much time you are spending on those kind of apps or on the computer, and then actually challenging yourself for a period of time of going, can I actually delete those apps off my phone for a number of weeks or set a timeline and say, instead of doing that, can I invest that time into some of the hobbies, as we were talking about earlier, some of the things that we know will actually give us joy in a different way. So yes, it is still doing something, but I think it's actually feeding your soul in a different way versus just it taking from you. And I think that's what social media does tend to do for 99% of people. There's actually little to no return. Social media is built to connect one another, and if anything, it's done the complete opposite.
Well, I would agree with that. And one of the things I would say is you often hear people say, I'm having a dry October, or I'm having a dry month, or I'm going to go alcohol free for the next 12 months. So it's no different than going, okay, I'm going to go social media free for, and that's how I got off social media, because I said,
Yep.
I'm going to go social media free for a week. And at the end of the week, I was like, oh my gosh, that felt so good. I think I'm going to extend it another week. And then before I knew it, it had been a month. And I just was like, I don't miss it at all.
So I think in modern day, that would be a huge recommendation that I would say I've seen has worked for myself and for other people. Even deleting the social media apps off your phone or tablets or technology for a period of time, and also having no phone zones throughout your home. And you even be amazed at people you live with, how much more you actually end up talking to one another.
Absolutely.
Because for such a long period of time, everyone's just stuck to a screen and there's no connection. No one knows how anyone's day is, or if it is, it's just surface level. And again, as you said, we've actually forgotten how to connect and be human being with one another.
Absolutely. I would agree. And I think the other thing is making that choice to do the slowing down. When you slow down and you give yourself that chance to go for a walk in nature, or you choose to start your day by just sitting in silence for a short period of time, I couldn't believe how much space that created in me. Like, it was very difficult in the beginning. And as I often said to you and to many other people, the first few times I decided just to sit with no distractions, the amount of times that my body automatically got up before I even knew I was getting up, because my mind had said, oh, you should put on a load of clothes, or you should do this, or you should do that. And I would have to force myself to sit back down and just be there. And I want to clarify, when you and I talk about that, we're not talking about sitting and not having any thoughts.
Yep.
We're talking about just sitting and allowing those thoughts to run past us, and we're just not acting on any of them. It's just one of the ways that you can start, and you will see very quickly when you try and do that how addicted you are to the doing.
I think even once we have that ability to be aware of our obsession with doing and the business in our lives, and we're trying to begin to actually question how we can create balance, it's only then that I think we can give ourselves permission to actually slow down. Because like anything, when we're creating change in our lives, there's a process of having to question it logically, then it starts processing emotionally, then physically, and there's layers to it, as we've talked about many times before. So I think even sharing some of the benefits of actually what it means to slow down, because just saying that we need to slow down is often not enough for us to take it seriously, because we don't understand often why we should to start with.
It's kind of like that just say no, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, just slow down. It's not that easy.
Just stop it.
It's not
Kim, with your drinking, just stop.
Just stop.
It's not that hard.
Yeah.
But so we both know it's not that simple. So sometimes we do need that logical explanation of why we should. And then also sometimes we do need permission to be able to slow down as well, because often everyone in life has been telling us to speed up for so long.
Exactly.
So therefore we have to find that middle ground even for ourselves. And sometimes we do need that explanation, external validation. But there is such benefits to be able to slow down. And I know even when it comes to meditation, which is obviously huge out there, and mindfulness, spirituality, self-help, psychology, the list goes on. And we did talk about the benefits and some of the disadvantages of actually meditation in our episode of Meditation Expectations, which I think would be a very interesting episode to listen to if you do meditate quite often, or else even if you're just starting to get into the world and of meditating and doing it for yourself.
So, well, I think meditation is a great way to start to do the slowing down and being present. I think it's becoming aware of what is your driver to do the meditation. And the more that you can pay attention to why you're actually doing something, what you're hoping to get out of it, then that will give you more benefit when you achieve it. So the other thing I'd like to say, Gareth, is one of the other major benefits is if we take that time to go out and spend time in nature, however that shows up for you, whether that's going for a hike or whether that's going out and taking a walk on the beach or simply just sitting in the sun, grounding in your own backyard for 5 minutes. All of those
Yep.
things connect us to ourselves in a completely different way than when we're rushing through life. There's nothing like, as I used to say it all the time when I took my kids camping when they were growing up, it would be this mad rush to get there. And sometimes people would say to me, it seems like it's more work than it's worth. And I went, the benefit comes the minute you get there and everything's set up. There's nothing to do but just sit in nature. And it was so fulfilling. The kids enjoyed it. They were out playing. They were in the water. They were on the grass. They were making up games. They were connecting with other kids. And so for me, it was just a real peaceful time. And I think that is the kind of things that so many people miss out on when they're really busy, busy, busy.
But as you were mentioning earlier, it is in the small details of actually starting this process of building awareness of why we are busy doing what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it might be because, as we talked about, some of it because it just has to get done, and some of it, out of the other activities, because we're running.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there is a fine line between the two. And of course, it's times where they overlap, but no one else can tell us that reality until we actually sit down and look at it. And I feel for any of us, the journey in life is going to, I want to say, force us at some stages to actually have to look at it. And that's where to mention about illnesses or colds, flus, chronic illnesses, is that life has its own way of actually forcing us to stop to look at the journey that we're on. And that is completely different for every person. But to me, there's no running away from that reality.
No, I think we are meant to get that at some level while we're here. I think it's a definite thing that we're meant to have the experience of.
Is there a right and wrong in that? Of course not.
No.
But at the same time, it's that there's always going to be more things to do. The list never ends for as long as we have breath in our body. But I think it's understanding the mind, body, emotion, souls component of why we're doing what we're doing and why.
And that's a trick for anybody. And sometimes it's just easier to stay busy than to figure out why we're doing it. Once we get curious, as you often say, and we really dive into it, I think we'd be surprised at some of the benefits that come from doing just that. Some of the benefits are when you start to realize that the more that you sit with you, or the more that you are tuning into you instead of all the busyness in your life, then you have a clear understanding of what does bring you joy, of what does make you happy. Like, I used to think that I needed so much to be happy. I honestly know now that I need so little in order to feel that happiness and that joy, because I've had the ability to stop, slow down, and not be caught up in what we used to call the rat race.
Yep.
And just be here. So I think, just to recap, one of the things that we're trying to say is our culture has really pushed the busyness. And in that busyness, we tend to lose ourselves. And what we're talking about today is the busyness versus the being. And taking that time to simplify just to be becomes really vital for our well-being. It becomes vital not just for our physical well-being, but our emotional well-being, for our spiritual well-being, and also for our soul, because so many people go, oh, I don't know what my purpose is, but there's no time to even have the space to reflect on that. So this is why it becomes so vital to take this time and learn how just to be with you. And when you can go ahead and just find those little, it doesn't even have to be huge amounts of time to start with. It can just simply be these little tiny pockets of stillness or quiet or time for you. Again, I'm just going to say this. When my kids were little and I was starting this, I used to give myself bath time. And I would say to the kids, now, Mom's going upstairs, and unless the house is burning down, no one knocks on the door.
Yeah.
Because that was me carving out that space for me to have time to be with me. And without that time, I am this running ragged, crazy woman. And with that time, I'm calm and I'm centered and I'm coming from a completely different place in my parenting. So it's just a suggestion. I don't think either one of us are saying this is a must, but it's certainly something that you'd like to go and have a look at.
Definitely. And I do think even coming back, say, to the spiritual component of it is that this is the way that everyone's lives are supposed to be built. And I think if you look at it is that I've learned over a long period of time to start trusting life that we're never not going to be not busy to some degree, but our awareness of how busy we are is what's important. And I think it's finding that balance, and sometimes let it be internally or externally, it comes in peaks and troughs. As in sometimes there's busy periods in our life, sometimes it is a simpler process. But either way, it's that, as you and I both know, Kim, it's most definitely outside of our control. And what I mean by that is that even when we have the awarenesses and we have the tools, we can begin to learn how to navigate it and create that balance with our own lives. But it's definitely not something that ever comes naturally to anyone. It's something that all of us have to learn to work towards. So some days are going to be better than others, some weeks or months are going to be better than others. And I think it's just a reminder to be patient with ourselves and to know that that's okay. And because of the busyness throughout our lives, or the obsession with doing, and even if it was for 3 decades of us going non-stop, we have to understand that there was and there is meaning and reason behind it being that way. It wasn't a waste of time, even though, as we both know, when we're just caught up in the chaos, life does become a blur. But we do end up creating families during that time. That is amazing meaning. We do end up actually building our careers, maybe even building our finances to some degree. I'm saying it isn't the details at times of the whys. So the experiences, the people that we meet, and even the people that we become. So at some stage in our lives, I always do trust, and that's why I say to people that it will unfold with time. And sometimes life will make that decision for you of when you have to start reviewing that and becoming aware. And sometimes we can make that independently. But either way, it's a part of our path, and that is different for every single person. So even if you feel or you're struggling with to let go of that obsession with doing now, that's okay, and it will come with time. But just please be patient with yourself.
I couldn't agree any more than that. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to explore these topics more with us, please go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. Not only will that help us keep producing these shows, but you'll also get advance access to each new episode, the opportunity to ask questions directly of Gareth and I, input into what topics we will cover on the show, access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. See you over on Patreon.